All right, folks, we are back with another episode of the Fireside PM podcast and live stream. For those of you who are watching, I am very pleased to welcome Raphael to the show. Raphael and I overlapped for several years when we were both in Zurich, Switzerland. And so this will be a fun opportunity to reconnect. Welcome to the show, Raphael.
Thanks, Tom, for having me. And I'm actually pleased to be in the fish tank for once. I watched your videos for the fish tank. So here I am now live. I could feel the fish.
Yeah. It's amazing how some of the most advanced Aquarius technology, a lot of it comes from Germany. So it's super cool watching, podcasts and videos from Europe talking about the fish as well. So it's a global hobby.
Cool.
So Raphael, why don't we start with a little bit about your background and where you got started, where a little bit about where you even grew up, and then your career so far, and then of course we'll spend most of the time talking about the topic of what you're working on now and product management in Europe. But let's start with a little bit about you.
Yeah. So I'll make it quick, and you can interrupt at any
Mm-hmm.
time. And if you want to go deeper, so I guess I had a typical nerd upbringing. Like I had a Commodore 64 when I was like 10 or 11. Toyed with it. Loved bit of programming, not so deep. I loved the networking part. Either pretend or real. Mailboxing stuff. And then I actually had the privilege really in the early days to get to know Unix and Linux. So I think already in 93, I had contact, the Solaris and sort of some Unix systems, SCO, Unix, and then actually Linux. And long story why I got there, but I started computer science in Berlin. Was debating different subjects, but it was clear it was computer. The only other subject was computer linguistics, which is sort of, I'm glad I didn't do it because it's a bit nichey. But the Linux thing matters because I didn't have a lot of money to spend. Tuition isn't high in Germany, but living costs are reasonable. So I always had to work on the side. So guess what? Because I knew Linux, I started to kind of do sysadmin stuff for all sorts of companies. I remember like one client was a training center, and we're talking now 95-ish, like really early days of internet. And so they had like internet classes and internet courses. And I found out a way that they could all access essentially one dial-up connection with a Linux router, essentially, right? Now it's laughably to even discuss that, but in 95, it wasn't that trivial. So I hooked them up with sort of a shared connection. And then out of that, developed my first startup. Actually, basically my startup. This was the idea to monetize Linux, build a service business and a product business around Linux and open source. So we were packaging components like an email server or a router or like a combination of a couple of components, and then actually got a lot of venture capital for it, which was very unusual back then. Like I was 25 at that point. I was CEO of the company, and we got in total about $15 million venture capital, including one of the biggest pension funds in the US, like the Capital Group in LA, which was really, really not what a typical average 25-year-old would do in Berlin back these days. And then the whole new economy craziness sort of started and collapsed. So we were profitable at some point, then got all this venture money, scaled like crazy, had big plans, and then essentially grew too fast, like a lot of the companies back then. We had IPO plans, we never IPO'd, and then the whole thing collapsed. And then I decided to leave because I thought I spent about 4 or 5 years at that point, and then finished first my CS degree, and then I did an MBA. Because frankly, I didn't really know what I was doing as CEO. Nobody taught me to run a company. So I thought I should do a condensed 1-year program at INSEAD to really, it had a bit of a self-therapy to it, because those were really, really wild times for a young for a young man. And it had, of course, a knowledge component to it, but like a bit solidifying. And it was a good, theory and practice combo. And then I did one more thing before I came to Google, which is also an interesting thing. It was not as impactful or successful, but it was still a very, very cool learning thing. And I joined a publicly listed company, a small company that was listed in Germany. They were like had offices, I think, all around the world, including Asia and the US. Like it was a 20-year-old company at that point, but they sort of were on a downtrend. And so they had a private equity investor coming in and bringing in a new CEO for essentially a turnaround scenario. So even though they were public, like one PE went in, I think bought about 30-40% of the shares. So I worked for the incoming CEO who would manage that turnaround. And I was essentially, you could say, his right hand. The official title was, I think, innovation manager. It was not product management yet, but I think it had a big PM component to it. But it was all about, new products. How could this turnaround work? What could be sort of growth stages and all of that? So interesting product, very mature market was information security. But for me, the coolest thing was really working with that person. So we're still sort of friends. We see each other once in a while. And just being so close to a publicly listed company and see the pressure on sales, on quarterly earnings, the private equity folks, right, had high expectations. So that was, in that sense, very interesting. It was not PM yet, but I would say it was the first thing that is sort of converging to a PM thing. And then I should say, maybe because I think you can relate to that, I had for a long time admired Google. And actually I think I had applied to Google already 2004, so just after the IPO. And I think they never even wrote back. So this was, I don't know how many people, because I always wanted to work in Europe, so I wasn't interested in going to the US. So they didn't even, go back. And then I kept applying. And I think the last time I applied was about 2007. So while I was at this private equity turnaround thing. And then that was a very humiliating experience, because I think I'm still to this day one of the longest interviewees, in a way that I think I went through 3 tracks. And back then the interviews were brutal. I mean, they were always hard. It's never easy going to brutal, but they physically were brutal. Like, I don't know, long days. And then again, I went to parallel, and then they went silent on me. So, and then finally, after a long time, I essentially got into Google in 2008, which was always my dream. And I was like in awe to join this company, because I was such a fan of everything, of the founders. They were actually, Google was founded roughly around the time I founded my startup. So there's a little bit, I don't want to compare it, of course, but I had a little bit empathy for founders at that age. We're about the same age. So that was a dream come true. I could have gone to London, Munich, or Zurich, and I decided to go to Switzerland because I knew there was a big engineering site. I liked Switzerland. I've never, lived there. So I thought, why not? And then the first thing I've done at Google is Google Maps, which, I think everybody knows and most people like. So it's a incredibly rewarding product, right? And I personally, my very first personal project was Google Transit, which is public transportation on Google Maps, which was, I mean, it's a long story in its own, right? How we came to be. There were like days where the founders were skeptical. This was actually the days where you still interacted with Larry and Sergey. But then Switzerland was the perfect country for public transportation, as you know. So there was also a lot of going for it. And that was also sort of a pioneer market for us. And then we made this thing a thing worldwide, right? We launched in, 50 countries or so with transit. And it was essentially established as an alternative to driving, and flying. So like now it's called multimodal, but it was the early days of having a multimodal thing. It wasn't easy. It was even computer science wise and tough stuff to do, because it's quite hard. We probably shouldn't go too much there, but it was very, very challenging, like on the algorithm level, to do that. And then I rose up the ranks in Geo. It was sort of the product area called Geo. and then worked on a couple of different things. Became a manager first, and a manager of managers, and then essentially my ultimate scope was essentially all directions on Google, everything, the traffic, which was very interesting because it had a feedback loop, and mobile became very important then, right? Like you would drive with your mobile, and then Google could learn from that, and then improve traffic for others. Like it was a fascinating thing that I think hadn't been done at that point. I've done things like Street View, especially Street View Germany, which maybe some of folks remember was a highly, highly political thing, because rightfully, this was the first time where one of the European countries, had concerns about, Google coming in. And Google was also a bit naive about privacy. I should clearly say that, because, Google was used to be cheered on. It was the early days of Google where, there was a lot of positivity, around everything that Google was pioneering. And this was a reality check, right? And so we had to face that. We developed blurring tools. Some of you remember that, like you could, partially blur out automatically things like faces or on license plates, but also you could say, I want to blur out my house. It's something we've only done in that market. So anyways, things like that. I've done privacy, which also is an interesting one with maps, because it collects location data and it's a very personalized thing, and it's very useful for maps to know, where are roads or pathways. So this was another thing. And I think the other big thing I ran, and the final thing on maps, is like internationalization. So we launched in Russia, in the Middle East, in Africa, like I think in over 100 countries. And launching with that type of product means actually acquiring a whole stack of data, because it's not just the thing you switch on and then people come, right? If you use a map product, you want to have a deep stack, right? Like roads, road signs, speed limits, business data. You want to be able to search, right? So it's not trivial. And so assembling that and launching it is a bigger deal. And then I was a little bit done with that. So that's 7 years. So I was quite committed, and I loved it. I loved the product. But I also thought, I've seen that now, and I'm hitting a little bit limits and learning curve limits. And then I thought, I think I should try sort of something that is really, really as different as it could get in that moment. And then I found basically Google Shopping, which is very different from Maps. I sometimes say, Maps was never a business, but it's an amazing product. And shopping is really the opposite, because shopping is an amazing business. It's like to this day, I think one of the biggest advertising segments for Google, because everybody shops. It's one of the biggest markets actually on this planet to buy things. Everybody buys things. But the product was never its own thing. There was never a shopping app. It was always integrated into search and into YouTube and others, which is good and bad, right? It is good because it was part of sort of a bigger journey. If you Google for products, and often the searches around products are quite complex, but it also meant it didn't have its identity like a Google Maps, which has a strong identity, right? So I guess the very, very cool thing there for me was, and I really don't regret a single minute of it, is just working with the business folks at Google. That's just such a contrasting experience, right? Because Maps was a pioneer thing. There was the Google Earth founders who I worked with for a couple of years, Marissa Mayer, like the Google luminaries. And then in shopping, you had finance, and you had Amazon, and you had a huge sales force. Like we had thousands of Googlers selling ads, right? This is part of the ads group now. And that's in other ways a very fascinating area, right? Like it's more MBA type of folks. It's very numbers driven. It's a lot of levers. It's just a business, right? So I made my way up there as well, and my ultimate position there was that I ran everything B2B. Like Google Shopping is a marketplace. You have users go on Google, and you have merchants or retailers like Amazon is one, and there are many others that want to advertise products on Google. And I was running essentially almost out of B2B. Still out of Zurich, by the way. As you know, Google is very distributed, but it also makes it super intense, right? Because at that point, I was a senior director. So essentially an executive job, and you're not doing small things there, right? Like you're tasked to more think about, business plans, strategy, headcount. It's an organizational thing, right? And it's not a small product or feature set that you're PMing. And that implies, lots of travel, lots of responsibilities, essentially, right, with other executives in Google. And I was part of sort of several leadership groups in the end in Google. And yeah, that just implies a certain responsibility and a more abstract way of working, to be honest, for good or bad. Maybe I'll stop now, because I think the next chapter is about leaving. And let you respond and let you ask any questions. Sorry, this was a long intro.
No, it was a great intro. Before we get into the post-Google life, I do want to unpack a little bit that transition from kind of product leader of a core team to, manager of managers and kind of executive organizational leader, in that those are such different roles.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, how did you manage your own transition into that different type of role? And, did you like it more, or how was it different than the older days of rolling up your sleeves and, working with users and engineers and, kind of slinging code around?
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's a blessing and a curse, because you gain something on every step. And I wanted to gain those things. I think I was always somewhat ambitious, right? And wanted to prove that I can step up and zoom out. But the curse is, as you know, because you've been through similar transitions, there's always something you lose, right? There's something you give up. And I mean, the first one, like you said, I think there are 3 steps here, right? There's, let's say, you might be a leader, but you're still a leader of a product. Then you become a leader of a group. And then you're becoming sort of a leader or co-leader of a division, right? Or an organization, right? Like, the end result was that I was part of the leadership team for about 1,000 people, right? And me and my engineer counterpart ran about 400 people out of the 1,000. I would say the first one, where you're still working on the product, yes. I mean, it's essentially you're still optimizing for product success, right? And that's cool. That's exciting. In Maps, it became repetitive for me, so I wasn't interested in another, country launch or another thing. So clearly, I ran there out of interest, and I've always had a knack for people management. I even in my company, right, I was pretty good at delegating. That's, by the way, something that not every senior Googler, I think, and I know you experienced this as well. There's vastly different styles in willingness and ability to delegate and start to build, a team that doesn't need you day to day, right? And for me, that was funnily always very easy. And I think for many people, that's very, very hard, and they feel torn, and they feel a big loss, and they feel, okay, what am I doing? Or no, I need to inject myself everywhere. So there's always, I think, for people, an inherent clinging to owning something and, being part of the doing. I always felt it's a relief if I can get good people sort of in a structure, and then I don't have to worry about that part, and I can start worrying about other parts. So I think mentally, I was always looking to free myself up from things so that I could easily step up and, just build a bigger thing, right? So I guess at that point, I switched from maybe product building to somewhat team building and group building. And it was still very rewarding for me, because I felt, I'm still somewhat involved. I handpicked my leaders, and we would still meet in product reviews, and we still had, I wasn't completely hands off, right? I mean, I think I found somewhat of a style that worked for me. Some people would call it hands-off. I would call it trusting my leaders and being just holding my leaders very accountable, so that I didn't have to catch issues, right? I always feel like if leaders feel they have to catch something in the final launch review or in the pixels, that's bad, right? I think that's too late, and then something else, went wrong. And I'm not talking about, finding a bug. I'm talking about if you structurally rely on your own skill set to second guess or, polish the final 10%, right? So I much rather let teams do that. The other step, I would say, was maybe the one for me that was a bit harder, because it was, for me, the ultimate step where I lost being in touch with the ground and the basics, right? I think it's inevitable. Again, it was about 450 people, not PMs, right? It was the total group. The PMs was maybe peak PMs was maybe 30 or 32 or so. But even that is, you cannot manage yourself like 30 people in the product. By the way, you asked how. I always had a mentor. I don't want to say the name now, but you might know him, like a senior person at Google, who spent a lot of time in Europe and then actually went back to the US. But I think he understood Europe well, and sort of the challenges of being distributed and making a career in a very distributed office, because it's very different to be successful not being at headquarters. That's a very different thing. And I would tend to say it's a bit harder even, because it's more indirect, right? It's you cannot be there every day where the sausage is made, because you're sleeping when the sausage is made, or the headquarters sausage. So you have to do your own sausage and then talk about your sausage, right? It's a more indirect way. But he was a very, very experienced corporate manager. I think he had a long career in in IBM. So I think I picked up a few executive skills from him, right? Like, again, being aware of your distance to the sausage factory, like the levers, and I observed him. He sometimes invited me to review meetings or management meetings, right? And I saw he was very deliberate about where to operate, right? Like which level, and then resist the temptation to become micro, right? And again, do pixel perfecting. So I think I picked it up a little bit, and I think at some point then I said, you know what, I want that type of job. And honestly, I wanted to prove myself, right? Because what we're now talking about is senior director level at Google. I always wanted to get to this point. I wanted to prove myself that I can, I started PM level 6, and then my ultimate was level 9. So that these 3 or 4 promotions, I wanted that. But and that might be a segue in a moment to leaving. There is a big loss, right? And I think what I realized one day is that I'm actually, and I don't mean this negative, but I really turn out to become a bureaucrat. And I mean it in a positive way, because you are running a bureau, right? You are moving abstract things. You're thinking about, who to hire, who to grow, who's your talent. But it is more a political job and more truly a management job than anything I've done before, right? And in a way, I wanted it, but I think I wanted it to a large extent because I felt I wanted to prove it to myself, right? There was sort of ambition and all of that. But I don't think I necessarily wanted that type of job for a long time. I mean, there are Googlers, and some of them, right, who make it to VP or SVP, who truly run armies of people, right? I mean, they are bureaucrats, right? And again, I say this respectfully, right? They are born to be huge organizational leaders and, run their armies, train their armies, and, make them efficient and excite them and be really almost like a combat leader. And I realized, that's too far away from, in the end, what I enjoy. So, and by the way, it was at the end more about joy and fun for me, like when I started to maybe have doubts, and it was about anything else. So I think I got reminded, maybe a bit to your point about what I lost or kind of what the price was. And then I realized, actually, you know what? I sort of like some of those things. So that's maybe was the seed of also thinking about leaving them.
Yeah, that reminds me. There are times when I'm interviewing people for roles on in the company, and they'll ask me like, "Oh, what were some of your favorite moments at Google?" And I often start with my first job as an L6, sitting with like 7 or 8 engineers in one room and a designer to my right, and we just like got stuff done.
Yeah.
That is a certain kind of magical moment and experience that you don't really get as a manager of managers.
Yeah.
And so I totally empathize. So you got to senior director, which is an extremely hard level to get to at Google.
Yeah.
And a lot of people would be like, "Oh my God, this is great! You're on the path to VP. Like, let's keep going." Tell me about the decision to do something different, and what did you end up doing?
Yeah. So I should also say at that point, I was at Google about 12 years when I sort of started to just think about, am I enjoying what I'm doing, or do I want to maybe adjust and or maybe do one more thing, right? Because at that point, everything I said now was 7 years maps and then 5 years shopping. So the other alternative could have been, for example, join YouTube, one of your jobs at Google or other areas, and do another cycle, right? That would have been another alternative. But the thing is, I took a year off. So it started with a sabbatical, like a 1-quarter thing, but then Google was very kind to me, and I asked them and I could extend it. So in the end, I took 9 months or so and did a lot of introspection, right? About, what type of work did I do? How has Google changed? I should also say that. And now there's an old Google and there's a current Google. And I'm not saying that the current Google doesn't make sense. Actually, it makes a lot of sense for a company that's so much in the spotlight and has to manage risks and opportunities. And I mean, generally is much more on watch, rightfully so. Google has to be different, right? But the old Google was much more greenfield, autonomy, go. And the current Google, again, very rightfully, is much more, okay, where do we invest? What are the priorities? What are the risks? I mean, look at OpenAI, right? I'm not an expert, but there is an element of Google being challenged by a company that just has less legacy and less constraint, right? And Google has a lot of those. So what I'm saying with all of that, I think I realized that sort of I outgrew Google a bit, or Google, has maybe got to its own trajectory. And then I thought, just another switch wouldn't really truly bring me new joy, right? Because I think also like I outgrew, I mean, to our previous discussion, I maybe outgrew the opportunity. This is the curse element of it, right? As a senior director, you're not normally, it's not even accepted at a company like Google that you would toy with your own new thing, right? I mean, sometimes they would allow it, but then there's expectations around results and team size and all of that. Yes, you could become an IC again, but do you want that, right? So long story short, I decided that, 13 years was amazing. And, there's this old saying, you should quit when it's when you're at the peak. And I thought, if I leave now, I'm leaving in really on the best possible terms for me, for Google. And I'm not grinding through its complicated phase, right? I would essentially leave at the top of everything. And I think that gave me a lot of confidence, and also maybe it just felt good, right? To say I'm leaving when it's just a very bright and positive moment. And they were very nice, and I'm still in touch with many Googlers. But yeah, I took this year to really do a lot of introspection, and there's a little bit of a, midlife. So I was about 44, 45 at that point, 46. It was a little bit of an introspection moment as well, right? I mean, I had this quite intense career. Again, startup at age 22, MBA, this job, maps. I mean, none of this was boring or slow, right? There was a lot of compression in those 20 years. And essentially I said, you know what, I want to keep working, but I want to do it a bit on my own terms. And I also want to do it basically out of a genuine kind of intrinsic need and fun and passion, and less, be part of this big machine, right? Where, there's everyday new constraints or ideas or pressures, right? I wanted to do my own thing. And maybe one important thing to mention that I hadn't mentioned yet is that about 2013 or 14, I started a product management conference in Zurich. And the conference, many people know it. It's called the Product Management Festival. And I was the co-founder, essentially started with the idea for me. I was very grateful that, to the previous discussion, that Google gave me finally an identity. I was a PM at Google, and I felt this is actually my job. For the first time in my life, I felt this is it. I found my role. I found my job, right? Because it combined technology, business, MBA, people. I mean, as you know, as the audience knows, I mean, it can be a very rewarding thing. But then also Europe was, and still is, and we can get to this in a moment. Google is behind. Europe is behind. Google is probably in the US one of the leading companies ever in this space, but Europe was very far behind, right? So I thought, I should create a platform where folks can, to some extent at least, learn, right? Exchange, have some learning curve together, have a community that engages on product, right? So we call it Festival, and started very small, a couple of 50 folks or so, became really big, like over 1,000 people. We did it in Singapore as well, like a dual thing. But really my interest was, it had an element of giving back. It had an element of gratitude towards Google, but also like really this vision, desire that Europe would get tech a little bit more, and also managers at Google would get tech a bit more and have a handle on do it the Google way, right? Because it's not very practical if you tell people, well, do it like Google, right? Because Google is a lot of things, and not everything is causal to Google's success. I would actually argue not many things are causal to Google's success, but I do think product management is causal to Google's success. It's one of the key ingredients. And then maybe to close the leaving chapter and then the new thing now, I'm partnering in a company we call Peak Product that essentially runs product management in Europe. And we do a conference. That's the conference I just mentioned. It's like I would say one of the biggest and I hope best or most useful conferences around product management. We have speakers, from like practitioners. We like some people that, write books and are good at theory, but we have a lot of practitioners. Like last year we had WhatsApp, we had Stripe, keynotes, Facebook, Google, YouTube. I mean, it's really people that are in the prime of their careers, and then often, talk about the product, but also talk about their journeys, right? Like the conversation we have right now, in a very condensed and practical way. We have AMAs and all of that. So it's really a forum and podium for folks to learn. That's one thing. We do an executive program together with INSEAD, my business school. This is much more top end for folks that are PMs and wanna become C-level. So this is more about board. This is about product and executives. This is about product plus. So this is about zooming out. This is a kind of a top end of the market thing, because those things are different, right? The conference is very different from that. And the other thing I'm doing, and this is where I now spend most of my time on, is actually explaining product management to business people in Europe. So the thing is this: when I left Google, when I took the year to think about, I was still somewhat too optimistic, I think, about the way how Europe has caught up and has understood product management and tech in general. And I was too optimistic here. So what I mean by that is that, of course, the US is also kind of heterogeneous, right? And of course, you have the coast, and then you have a lot of non-tech, obviously. But I think my observation is tech has, to some extent, is to some extent understood, right? And especially in the Bay Area, but I think beyond. And there's sort of a general convergence of management and product management and tech management, right? It's sort of understood that you can almost not be a product leader these days, sort of a business leader that doesn't understand product, right? Or you cannot be successful as a company if you don't have a successful product, right? I think that's sort of understood, right? And in Europe, we have something that I call the Exec product gap. And that's, I think, a big deficiency and a big challenge for Europe, is that this thing hasn't happened yet, right? So you have a generation of leaders, and I'm talking now people that own the budgets. I'm talking CEOs, I'm talking COOs, I'm talking CFOs. I'm not talking product people now. I'm talking about people that run companies, right? People in BMW, in basically in France, right? In the industry that really produces growth for those countries. It is still very old-fashioned, right? And it has a lot of the things that I think Google and tech have solved, like matrix teams, shared OKRs, empowering teams, working for a user, not be finance-driven, not be sales-driven, right? Stuff that I think we all think is sort of obvious at this point. It's not obvious at all, right? So the big journey I'm now on is to try to close this gap, this exec PM gap in Europe, which essentially means it's talking to a lot of C-level people, CEOs, COOs, and explain product to them, right? And it could be that it's a coaching I do. It could be that, we help recruit a CPO, or maybe they have a CPO and then we help them recruit a leadership team, or maybe we even come in and help with an OKR process. So it depends a little bit, but we tend to come in very, very high level. It's actually funnily often combined with maybe venture capital or private equity folks bringing leaders in, and or executive search folks placing new leaders, and then we are sort of getting a head start with those leaders and go on a joint mission for them. But the idea is that we do it at interim, right? So we would do this maybe for half a year. We now sometimes do it over a year, but the sweet spot for us is 6 to 9 months, and then really elevate the team, right? Like establish a product culture, establish a culture, and make product understood, have good enough processes and methods, run through an OKR cycle once or twice, a planning cycle, and then let the company run on its own, right? And then we're still there if they need us. And often there's long-term relationships formed, but essentially getting them to kind of give them that boost to hopefully get to that level. That's essentially the work I'm doing right now. I thought it's easier. Honestly, I thought Europe would be ready to say, yes, I'm happy to do it like Google does, or Tesla or Apple. But I think there is still a lot of ground to cover, and there's still a lot of education. I'm sort of also betting on a new generation of leaders, like maybe the 35-year-olds now, or maybe early 40s, that are just socialized differently with technology, right, and tech, and then would bring this culture into the companies.
It is so interesting that you perceive this gap or difference in product leadership and product development between, let's say, Silicon Valley and European players. Yet when I think about amazing products like Dyson vacuums or Porsche EVs now, even or Swiss pharmaceuticals, like there's no shortage of amazing innovation and engineering in Europe. What is the cause of this gap that you're perceiving? Because it seems like the raw material is there.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not sure. It's actually a good observation, by the way. I mean, Porsche, to be clear, I think it's a 100-year-old company, right? So I would assume, yes, I agree, the EVs transition is good, but they're still sort of executing a Porsche plus Tesla playbook, right? I don't think it's 0 to 1. And that would maybe be my general comment. I think Europe is still super good at 95 to 100, or looking at innovation in Asia or in the US and then implement it. But I mean, you know how much Volkswagen is struggling, in EV, or actually in software. I wouldn't even say EV, right? Like all the cars, from what I know, I mean, it's not easy for them, right, to come up with new UIs and make the cars really, really great. So there is an element of, is it a radical enough, ability? Is it a radical enough change? And I do think we're getting to things like, is it still waterfall? I think a lot of European companies think still very waterfall-y, very much, okay, we're going to launch by X, and then we're going to launch what we have, right? It's not necessarily thought out like a PM would do, right? Like, what's the highest ROI? What's the highest impact thing? What's the MVP? Or maybe even the good first product, right? And then deduct it backwards. And then the big failure is software, to be honest, right? I mean, SAP is one of the very few global software companies that matter, and there's a huge gap, right? I mean, I do see a point. Hardware plus software is maybe still something Europe is good at, but the question is it gonna continue to be hardware driven, or is the software element gonna grow, and is Europe ready for that thing? And there I would have my doubts so far.
And why do you think it's been hard on the software side? There are certainly examples where, like Spotify has done extremely well, or, there's, TransferWise, Telegram. There are these European startups that are software driven.
Yeah.
They're not, I would imagine they're not as a percentage of companies, not nearly what you see in the US. Like why is it hard for Europe to do more around software innovation?
Yeah. I mean, of course, there are examples, right? Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Of course, there are examples. And you mentioned 5, and I think we could probably together mention another 15.
Yeah.
But look at market caps, right? Look at the DAX, look at the CAC 40, look at the FTSE. I mean, there's probably not a single software company in those stock markets, or maybe it's 1 or 2, right, in the top 100 companies. I mean, almost all the big companies in Germany, just for example, as one country, right, are companies that are essentially 100 years old, right? It's chemical companies, it's automotive companies. So I think structurally speaking, unfortunately, Europe is behind, and is cognitively understanding that tech is software is eating the world, and everything is to some extent becoming a tech company. But then, and this goes to my point about product management, right? What's the lever you have as an executive, right? That's the big thing. Do you call this digital transformation? Do you call this agile? Do you call this, I don't know, do you go to McKinsey, right? How do you, because I think the CEOs know that, right? I mean, Volkswagen used to have the previous CEO that was just ousted half a year ago. I think he met Elon Musk like every quarter, right? I mean, he was totally getting it that they're falling behind. I think the big challenge, the big thing is the implementation gap, right? Getting the right people, getting rid of the old culture, being more 0 to 1, right, versus incremental. And that's just a huge, I guess, learning curve collectively, right? And then, I mean, you see it in cities like Zurich now. Googlers leave Google. Googlers start startups because Google has a like several thousand folks office here. And then you see seeds of innovation, right? So I think that's why I'm saying this is almost a generational thing. All those companies you mentioned and the others are gonna, have alums that, gonna start things. The venture capital is okay now in Europe. It's just a process, right? And the impact has to be earned. It's just taking time,
It reminds me, I spent 13 years in Seattle, and there was always, and probably still is, this kind of little brother syndrome between Seattle and the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah.
And we would always ask ourselves, like, why aren't we getting as much venture capital as the Bay? I mean, not even when you adjust for size of population, it was just no comparison. And over many, many years, it has gradually gotten better and better. And now, I think the gap is less, but it's still material. It does take, I think it is generational though. It really, it's not something you can fix in or catch up in like 5 or 10 years. It's decades.
Yeah. The good thing is if I go back to my introspection, right, the one
Mm-hmm.
year where I thought, okay, am I gonna continue like become a VP or SVP at Google? Is that how I want to spend sort of the next 10, 20 years of my life?
Mm.
Or is it in a way actually an interesting challenge to work on something so long term
Yes.
that not many people can do it, right? I mean, I'm privileged in a way that I have a certain amount of freedom,
Mm-hmm.
I have a certain amount of um, knowledge and experience. So you could also say, isn't it a cool challenge, right? For again, a
Yeah.
second half life thing, and I think that's what I concluded, right? It's maybe a little bit less comfortable, but it's incredibly inspiring, right? And I think I can have an impact, right? We can actually have impact, and it's slow and steady, right? But as we all know, there is rarely anything like an overnight success, right? I mean, all the overnight successes, most of them, have years in the making.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm actually not deterred by this being hard and long. In a funny way, I'm actually attracted to it because it sounds to me like actually the Google founders always said that, right? Like work on the hard problems, don't work on the
Mm-hmm.
easy problems, right? The hard ones are the ones where you have less competition. It's more fun. You get mission-driven people, and one day you wake up and you say, "Oh my God!" Right? And I think even today with the conference or with the consulting we're doing, right, I see already that it's worth it, right? And we have some impact, and yeah.
So I know we're a little over time, so maybe I'll wrap up with, if you fast forward 10, 20 years, what metric or what milestone will you want to look for to know that you've achieved the impact that you wanted? What would be your personal OKR for
Yeah.
15 years out?
It's funny that you say it or that you ask it that way, because I just met a friend today and we were discussing a book that we both found quite touching. It's called How Will You Measure Your Life? It's by Clayton
Mm.
Christensen. Maybe you know him.
Yeah.
You were at HBR, I think, right? Or
Yeah, yeah,
Harvard
yeah.
Business School.
I took one of his classes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know him better than me then. But I found it very touching that this guy, who is one of the, really truly most acknowledged business thinkers, in the end has, and again, might know him better, but that's what I know, like his talks and his books, has like reframed some of his theories in the second half of his life more around, well, if you look at your own life, right? If you look at
Mm-hmm.
your own balance sheet, what are the trade-offs, right, that you made, and what did you optimize for, right? Is it business impact? Is it money, or is it maybe other things, right? So I found that inspiring, right? And it has an age thing as well, right? If I think
Mm-hmm.
above a certain time, when you can choose what you work on,
Yeah.
it might be rewarding, right? To not see it, for example, only driven by revenues, right? It's hard for me to, of course, I could say, I want my company to be, I don't know, 100 million revenues and 500 people, right? I could say that, but I'm more interested, I guess, on the impact that we're having, right? So something like, I don't know, products launched that we touched, right? Or that where we had a meaningful contribution, right? Or we had a step change in their teams, in their products, in their methods. So attribution gets harder and harder, and I know it gets a little bit more diluted, but I don't mind that, right? I think,
Mm-hmm.
again, my first half of my life, I was really measuring core metrics a lot, and now take a little liberty to say, I might not even be able to measure everything that I'm impacting, but who cares? If I
Mm-hmm.
feel there's impact, if I get gratitude or positive feedback or smiles, right? If it's at the conference, or if I'm just feeling this is worth it, that's pretty good for me, these days.
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it does sound like you're contributing to an ecosystem and kind of a generational step change in Europe's ability to build and support, innovation.
yeah,
And that's in everybody's interest, and the consumers all over the world will benefit. So
yeah,
it'll be exciting and it's definitely has a legacy to it that,
yeah,
shipping a product in and of itself may not have as much of over the long run.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love it. Well, Raphael, thank you so much for coming on the show. If people want to learn more about the Peak kind of consulting group? Like, how do they find out more about that?
Peakproduct.io, or search
Mhm.
for us on LinkedIn, or find me on a Google search, Raphael Leiteritz, and reach out.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for spending a
Thank you
little
so
bit
much,
of
John.
your weekend, and we'll see you in the future soon. Take care, buddy.
Yeah. Thank
Bye.
you. Ciao.
See ya.